Welcome to the Cuda Photography Podcast, a podcast about nature and wildlife photography in your own backyard and throughout the United States. Okay, welcome back to the podcast. This is Matt Cuda, and this is episode 41. Well, spring is really well underway at this point. Here in North Carolina, we've got beautiful green leaves sprouting. We have birds singing. We have birds nesting. I have a lawn that needs to be mowed, unfortunately. So with every good thing always comes something a little bad as well. Well, again, welcome back. In this episode, I'm going to split things up a little bit. The first part of the episode is going to be a recap of PhotoWild and my experiences there this year. And then the second half of this episode will be continuing on our Flash and Nature Photography series. So we had PhotoWild. Now, PhotoWild, for those that have followed this podcast, you know I use PhotoWild a couple of different ways. First of all, PhotoWild is an event that is set up by Carolina Raptor Center in Huntersville, North Carolina. And it's an event that is a relaxed atmosphere. Other photographers come. We had probably 30 photographers there over the 2 days. It was a time where we can chat with each other, talk about gear, talk about wildlife. It's a time where we can get up close and personal with our subjects, something we can't do in the wild very often. And so for that reason, I like it. I also like it because Carolina Raptor Center is also a raptor hospital, and a very well-known raptor hospital in the southeast. And they take care of wounded raptors that are shot or hit by cars or just sick in some way. And so they get my money for coming to this event as kind of a benefit. And so I really appreciate them, and I appreciate what they're doing to help wounded raptors. So that's what PhotoWild is. Now, for photographers, let's get selfish here. Again, for photographers, it's great for socializing. It's great for testing out new equipment. It's great for getting up close and personal with the birds, like I said. And so it's a good time to just get your gear out, check it, try different techniques, all this good stuff. It's a great warm-up exercise for the year. And along with that, I had several strategies going into PhotoWild this year. And I'm going to go over those here real quick. The first strategy that I used is actually old school, and that is using more manual focus where appropriate. Say, what did he say? Did he say manual focus? Yes, I said manual focus, right? Why is that? Because sometimes autofocus will fail us. And one of those scenarios where it will fail you is in lower light conditions where the contrast on the subject may be not contrasty enough for the autofocus to get a proper lock. You may think that you have a lock, and in fact, it's just slightly out of focus. That happens with lower light situations. The other thing that happens with autofocus typically is it'll autofocus on the wrong part of the bird. So even if you put your autofocus point over the bird's eye, for example, and by the way, we all should know by now that the eye has to be tack sharp in any portrait, whether it be a human or an animal. So sometimes when you're autofocusing and you got that autofocus point on their eye, it actually focuses on their eyebrow, for example, or an eyelash, or the facial disc of an owl, for example. And that may or may not be what we want. In this case, I use manual focus. I was very close to the birds. I could fill the frame with the birds and focus. And so I had a lot more keepers just because I used that technique. This is not a a new technique. It's not a technique that no one else uses. Actually, if you talk to a lot of portrait photographers, they frequently will use manual focus. Okay, so that was the first strategy. The second strategy was to stay with one subject longer. When you're at an event like this, there's a temptation to simply move from species to species to species. So what does that look like? I mean, you think about it. You've got a Swainson's hawk. You've got a Eurasian eagle owl. You've got barred owls. You've got red-tailed hawks. You've got rough-legged hawks. You've got barred owls, Saker falcons, juvenile broad-winged hawks, British barn owls, king vultures. The list goes on and on and on. If you're constantly hopping from bird to bird, you're getting a lot of different species, but you're not getting necessarily great photographs. If you stay with a bird, for example, the first bird that was on my list was the Swainson's hawk. Now, at the same time that was being photographed, the Eurasian eagle owl was out, the barred owl was out, and the red-tailed hawk was out. And I decided to go strictly with the Swainson's hawk for the first half an hour. And so I stayed with them, and I got some good shots. Nothing great happened, but I got some better shots. So I generally used that theme all day long. And sometimes if I felt like the subject was not going to cooperate, I would move on. But having that strategy, I think, it pays off long term for you. Short term, you may feel like it's not going to work, but trust me, staying with one subject for a long period of time is more likely and more probable to pay off. The third thing that I did, was knowing that PhotoWild has some areas that are quite dark, quite shady. I used my 1D Mark III because it's a much, much better at low light performance than my 7D. And I could shoot easily at 2000 ISO and not worry about it. So that was my strategies. They all paid off great. This PhotoWild actually was a better PhotoWild than I've seen in the past. They had a big, their flight area, they created a new flight area, and because they did that, they opened up a big slot in the forest, and that allows the morning light to pour through. And so they were setting some of the birds up in areas where we were getting that great morning light, and that was awesome. It really helped things out. So kudos to the folks down there. I recommended that they do that years ago, but they don't listen to photographers. We're not their main target audience. So some other observations that frankly were frightening. Now I was observing other photographers occasionally while I was there, and their skill levels ran the gamut from rank amateur to professional level to advanced amateur and everything in between. But one of the things that I noticed that was kind of startling was that people did not know how to use their camera. They just didn't know how to use it. One guy got to the flight portion and he didn't know how to turn on continuous shooting. I don't know what to tell him. I mean, if you don't know how to do that by the time you get there, then chances are you probably don't know how to use AI servo either, or turn that on. So if you're in that category, I really, really encourage you to, pick up your camera maybe once a day, maybe a couple times a week, get familiar with the controls, read the manual for your camera. It should be fairly automatic. You shouldn't have to think very much at all, maybe a second or two to make changes. Other than that, I mean, it kind of blew my mind. The other thing I noticed was I was the only person out of 30 people using a flash when I needed to. There's this idea out there, and I don't know how it got started. Honestly, I don't. There's this crazy idea out there that if you have a high ISO camera, you don't need to use a flash. That's the biggest bunch of malarkey that's being perpetuated out there. All higher ISOs allow you to do is increase the gain to your sensor so that you can take photographs with higher shutter speeds and so forth. It doesn't improve the quality of light or the direction of the light. It just gives you more gain. Well, you're still going to have the same problems. You're going to have, too much shadow in their face. They're going to have a lifeless look. They're not going to have that eye sparkle. Their feathers are going to be dead and lifeless. How many times have you, and this happens all the time, you'll see somebody take a picture of a barred owl in the wild, and it'll just be this dark, kind of blobby looking thing with very little detail and so on. That's because the barred owls typically are back in the canopy and on a branch, and they're in pretty much what I would call heavy shade, deep shade, if you will. And so you can't do that. You need to pop a flash, because if you don't pop a flash, you're never going to be able to fill in those shadows. And we're going to get into that in the next part 3 of using flash in nature photography. But that was a huge thing, and I want to encourage you to just even buy a cheap manual flash and start understanding it. Hopefully after this series I'll spark you to get out there and do it. Anyway, that kind of blew my mind. And then the third thing I noticed from other people there was a failure to understand light direction and quality of light. And that kind of goes with the flash as well. But folks, if the sun is shining toward you, you're in a backlit situation. In other words, the light is falling on the back of the subject. Now, sometimes that's desirable, but almost always with bird photography, it's not, unless you're doing a silhouette or you've got a little bit of rim lighting you're working with and you're using fill flash. That's another possibility. There are possibilities there. But for beginners and so forth, get the sun behind you so that it's illuminating your subject, particularly with birds, because birds typically look better with bright illumination, whether it be from a flash fill or actually the sunlight itself. And this is not just subjective. This is probably 90% of the wildlife photographers out there that are worth anything would agree with that statement. So that was PhotoWild. I encourage you to find something like this in your area. It's a great way to practice. It's a great way to get shots you never could get in the wild in a million years. And it's a great way to socialize and help a cause of getting raptors back out into the wild again. Okay, so let's start the using flash in nature photography part 2. So we talked about a bunch of things last time. We talked about what types of flashes to buy. We talked about, the different types of flashes. And we talked about how to use it on your camera and pros and cons and all that stuff. So we got the hardware out of the way, kind of. Let's talk about how to trigger your flash. And this is more hardware oriented. One of the things I talked about in the last episode was getting your flash above your camera, and if possible, off axis. Now, why is that? Why do you want that? As I explained in the last episode, the last flash episode, getting your flash above the camera will reduce steel eye in animals and red eye in people. And that's one of the biggest reasons pros do it. That's one of the biggest reasons right off the bat. Moving it off axis also helps with that. And it also will give you the ability to put a little bit of modeling on your subject. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean modeling, not modeling. Modeling, which is that if my flash is a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right, I'm going to get just a hair bit more shade on one side of the face of your subject than you do another. And that gives us a very three-dimensional look. It gives us depth in our images. But you can get carried away with that. Wildlife typically, birds in particular, I think look best from direct flash. But you can, use 45-degree angles and things like that for effect. But the important thing again is get that flash above your camera. Well, how do we do that, right? How do we get our flash off the camera? Well, there are things that are made called triggers. They're flash triggers. There are optical triggers. There are radio triggers. And there are motion / IR triggers, infrared triggers. And we're going to talk about those three things on this installment of Flash and Nature Photography. So optical triggers. What is an optical trigger? An optical trigger is also referred to as a slave trigger. And these things have been around for many, many years. I don't know how long they've been around, but I was using them back in the mid-90s for weddings and so forth. And essentially what happens is it's a sensor that's on your flashes or attached to your flash via the hot shoe, and it's triggered when another flash fires. So in other words, if I had two flashes and I was setting up for hummingbird shot, for example, a 3-flash hummingbird setup, if one of my flashes fires, let's say I fire my pop-up flash on my camera, and I have another flash off to my right, and I have a flash laid in the background, what will happen is when that flash fires, the first flash, the slaves on the other two flashes will see that flash because they have a sensor, a light sensor, and they will fire simultaneously. And so it's a wireless triggering system, if you will. There's passive slaves and there's active slaves. Active slaves, I'm not going to get into the minutia here, but active slaves are powered, and therefore they have more range, and they can change sensitivities and so forth. So, active is definitely better. What are the pros of optical triggers? There's no wires to mess with, of course. We're wireless. They're generally less expensive than radios. They're not subject to radio interference like a radio trigger might be. And typically, the other thing about optical triggers is they require a line of sight, right? They need to be able to see the flash fire. So another con with them is that the cheaper passive types tend to be influenced by sunlight. So as nature photographers, we could be sitting there getting ready to photograph a hummingbird, and the sun hits it just right, and then your flashes fire. And, that's not desirable. So for that reason, I don't use optical triggers in my setup. Now, I'm not saying you couldn't, but for me, I just don't. I find that they're just a little too unreliable for me. The second type of wireless trigger is called a radio trigger. And a radio trigger is exactly like you think. It consists of a transmitter, which is attached to your camera's hot shoe, and a receiver or multiple receivers that are attached to your flashes themselves. And typically what I will do in these scenarios is I will have, and I use this at PhotoWild actually, I will have my transmitter set up on my hot shoe at all times. And then you'll basically take the receiver and you'll turn it on the appropriate channel to match your transmitter. And then you'll attach that to the hot shoe of your camera, and then you'll attach the whole thing to maybe a light stand or a clamp or some kind of flash bracket. And so wireless, definitely a wireless option, excellent. There's no messing with cables again. The cons, you can get radio interference possibly, although I've never had that happen. You might have limited channels that you can use. Maybe you're, depending on which brand you buy, you may have limits on how many receivers will actually work with a transmitter. I find them to be very reliable. This is what I use for all of my work. There are a couple of different types of radio triggers. There are very expensive ones, like Pocket Wizard. And Pocket Wizard offers more options, more receivers, more bells and whistles. they're going to cost you $169. You can also buy a Newer or Cowboy Studio or any number of other brand names they go under. The Chinese-made radio triggers, which is what I use. They offer multiple channels. You can have up to 3 receivers for one transmitter, and they cost you about $20. So it's a great way to get into the Chinese-made radio triggers are a great way to get into it. Are Pocket Wizards more reliable? Oh yeah, definitely. So if you can afford to spend $160 to $200, depending on how many receivers and you're going to want in your setup, then you definitely want to go with the Pocket Wizard. But if you're fairly confident that you can get by without it, then just spend the $20 and go with Newer. Where do I use these? Like I said, I use them at PhotoWild. I use them when I'm doing fill flash on my birds out back. I use them for hummingbird photography. I use them. You can use them when you're doing portraits of your children in your house, portraits of your dogs, whatever. Anywhere you need a flash set up remotely, you can use it. So excellent thing to have. Highly recommend them. And it's one way to get your flash off your hot shoe. They do make, for those who are using TTL flashes, they do make, I might be wrong about this, but I'm about 99% sure that they make, maybe even Pocket Wizard does, I'm not sure about this, makes a TTL sync for the radio slaves, for the radio triggers. Don't just take my word on that. Do some research. I should have for the podcast. I did not, but again, I don't use TTL, so that's why I didn't really think about it. I'm a manual flash guy right now. That may change in the future, but for now, I'm manual only. And so, again, that's what I recommend. Now, the third type, which I also recommend, is called a motion trigger. Probably the best one out there right now, hands down, is a photo trap. And what these things do is this is how nature photographers, wildlife photographers, get shots of songbirds in flight. How they get shots of, a barred owl flying into its nest box at night with a mouse in its talons. This is how you can get shots of very skittish animals that you don't want to disturb and you want them to go about their normal behavior. Because let's face it, as photographers, we do have an impact on the wildlife. We should always be wary of causing ill behavior from animals. And one of the ways you can do that is by using a photo trap. And like I said, photo traps are not cheap. They're, almost $500 for a setup. But if that's something that you want to get into, I highly would recommend that. There are other inexpensive Chinese motion triggers that can mount on top of your camera on your hot shoe. I have not tried any of these. The reviews that I've read have been very mixed, depending on what scenarios you're trying to do. So do consider spending maybe a little more money in this case and getting something a little better. There are workarounds I've seen for the Chinese-made ones where you can put a little cardboard snoot on it, on the sensor, so that it's more fine-tuned for birds. But, if you want to go down that road, do your homework a little bit, and by all means, it's an excellent opportunity out there for that. But anyway, how these photo traps work is essentially, you have this beam of light, this infrared beam of light, I guess, if you will. And what happens is, as the subject that you're photographing passes through that beam of light, it's detected, and that fires your camera's shutter. And so you can imagine how easy it would be to get certain pictures like songbirds in flight and nighttime photographs of owls and so forth. That's something that I am toying with getting into, is the photo traps. And you may see me do that within the next 5 years. You may see me actually start using them. But for now, I'm content to just go about staying behind my camera and firing the shutter when I need to. The other type of trigger that I did not talk about yet is simply one of the oldest types of triggers, and that's a PC sync cord. A PC sync cord. And it's called PC because that's the type of connector that it uses, not a personal computer. Rather, it's the type of connector that connects your flash to your camera. And if you look on your camera, if you have, especially if you have one of the prosumer or pro cameras, you will see a little outlet on the side that is this round circle, and that is for a PC cable. And what you do is you plug one end into your camera, one end into your flash, and these PC cords come in various lengths, and you can also get your flash above and off axis with one of those. However, the reason I mentioned this last is because these things are fraught with peril. Some of the problems are, of course, you have a cord. Cords can get shorts in them. Cords tend to fall out of the PC socket on you after a while. You're constantly replacing them. So for that reason, I don't really recommend them. But you're certainly more than welcome to try them under controlled circumstances. Definitely would work. No problem. They're inexpensive. If you just want to get one flash up and away from your camera body, yeah, go for it. Go ahead and use one of these. We got some time here. We definitely have time to continue on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit. We're going to transition from the triggers that you would buy for your flash as an accessory to other accessories. And one of those types of accessories is called flash modifiers. And all a flash modifier is some kind of device that will actually modify the light that your flash is emitting to soften it or make the light harder or softer or extend the range of your flash. So I just want to spend a few minutes talking about that. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. The next episode, we're going to actually start talking about practical uses for the flash and how to use them. Actually, different scenarios and show some photographs of the pros and cons. So the first type of flash modifier is what's called a softbox, and a softbox is a lot like it sounds. It's a giant rectangle, actually a cubic kind of rectangle that basically has a kind of semi-translucent white material on one side that allows the flash to fire through it and soften it slightly. But what most people don't understand is that the reason a softbox softens the light that it produces is not necessarily because of the diffusion material that's used for the flash, but rather it's the size. With a softbox, you're increasing the size of your light source. And when you increase the size of your light source, it softens. That's why you see, if you go to a portrait studio, sometimes you'll see a massive softbox. And what they're trying to do there is they're trying to go for this ultra soft, feminine feel in their photographs. And so, on the wildlife and nature side of things, typically we're not necessarily going for that. What softboxes do for us, and I use a small softbox called a Luma softbox, and it's just a small rectangular device that velcros to your flash. And when you're in short range situations, like maybe you're doing backyard bird photography, or maybe you're at PhotoWild or something like that, you're photographing captive birds or whatever, it allows you to soften that light source slightly, so it's not quite so harsh and nasty. So that's typically what I use. Other people have used these. It's not the only wildlife photographer out there using them. Moose Peterson has used them in the past. So, they're definitely something to add to your toolbox. Or very inexpensive, I think $20 or $30 or something like that. The other thing that's very hot right now, and it's been hot for quite a few years, literally hot as well. It'll melt a hole through your lens hood if you're not careful. And that is called a Fresnel flash modifier. And some people call it a Fresnel. I think the correct pronunciation is Fresnel. I think the S is kind of silent there. Probably most well-known brand of this type of modifier is the Better Beamer. What does the Better Beamer do? The Better Beamer falls into a category called flash extenders. And essentially they take your flash and they throw it a whole lot farther because they use that Fresnel lens on the front of it to concentrate the light and make it brighter. I do not use one of these currently. However, it is on my list to purchase. It's just not a high priority right now. There are many, many wildlife photographers that use this. The biggest advantage you have is not only the distance that you can throw the light from your flash, but also you have short recycle times. So, when you're sitting there photographing a bird or something, you might be shooting 4 or 5 frames in a second, right? Or even faster. Well, your flash typically can't recycle fast enough to keep up with that. So you might have the first 2 shots flash, the next shot flashes off, the next shot flashes off, the next shot the flash is on. This helps with that because you can turn your flash down. And when you turn your flash down, it doesn't require as much power. So that's another huge advantage to using a Better Beamer or a Fresnel type flash extender. Definitely something to consider if you're doing wildlife. Is it a must-have? In some situations, absolutely. I can think of situations where you're photographing maybe a warbler in a darkened area. Maybe you're in a swampy area and it's dark, and you have to have a flash. Like I said, there are just those times where you have to have a flash, and the Better Beamer makes sense there. Do look into it. The reason I do not have the Better Beamer right now, and I would have it if it wasn't for one thing. One disadvantage to the newer TT line is the Better Beamer does not fit on the newer TT560s. That's a disadvantage. That may be something you want to consider. There is a more expensive one that's made. I can't think of the name of it right now. I believe it fits the Yungyo, but the Better Beamer, I'm not sure the Better Beamer even fits the Yungyo. I have to do a little more research on that, but they definitely fit all the Canon flashes, the main speed lights that Canon produces, and the main speed lights that Nikon produces. So you can definitely get one for those. The other type of flash modifier, the third type I'd like to talk about, is a reflector. And a reflector is something that all nature photographers should be aware of. A reflector is could be a piece of cardboard, white cardboard, could be some cardboard that you covered with aluminum foil. It could be a professional quality reflector that you buy from B&H Photo. And all that they do is they take the existing light and they reflect it into a spot on the subject that you need light on. Where would you use it? Let's take a flower, for example. Oftentimes, if you're in a situation where your flowers are backlit, so there's light coming in from behind it, that might be desirable. But you also might want to use a reflector to bounce that backlight coming in and bounce some of that back into the actual, front of that flower. So it gives it a little bit more details, a little more light on the front, a little more modeling, if you will. Perfect example. You'll see people use them with models quite frequently when they're on location. They make huge reflectors. They make small reflectors, massive 6-foot tall reflectors. So very inexpensive way to throw light around and fill light in on your subjects. That's pretty much all I had for this episode. The next episode, we're going to talk. We're going to have one more. I think we're just going to have one more flash episode in this series, and we're going to talk about how to actually use your flash in the real world. And that's something that a lot of those people that I was with Saturday and Sunday could have used. And I'm not trying to make fun of them. I'm just saying that you really do need to understand how to use it. It's an important tool in wildlife photography, particularly bird photography. We don't use it so much with mammal photography, mostly due to guard hairs and so forth that bears and things have, but absolutely a must understand thing for wildlife photography. And at least that's my opinion and many others' opinion. Anyway, that's all I have for today. Thanks for listening. Make it a great day, and get out there and enjoy nature. Bye-bye. Music for this episode was provided by Dr. Turtle.